Hello and welcome back. This is the Week 8 lecture, arriving a little bit late. As we know, we're taking some extra time with Wieland because it is a difficult book. I know some of us have fallen a little bit behind in terms of our overall schedule. That's not a big deal though, because right now, as I'm recording this, we are already on spring break, so we have a week off and we can use that week, as I've already said, to get caught up on Wieland. So that's my hope. That is the goal. So what we're trying to do now is finish Wieland over the course of spring break. And then when we come back for week 9, and that means Monday, March 29th, we should be ready to move on to our next text. So hopefully you're watching this near the end of spring break or perhaps the very beginning of week 9, and by this point you have finished Wieland and you're almost ready to move on. But of course, first you want to hear what I have to say. So I'll cover the second half of the novel today. We've already talked about the first half back in the week 7 lecture. So that feels like a long time ago. But I've covered the first half, so I want to pick up today with chapter 13. Kind of pick up where we left off last time. But let me just remind you guys of a few key concepts that I discussed back in the week 7 lecture. So obviously we are dealing with a Gothic romance here. I talked about that genre last time. Wieland is an example of a Gothic romance. A lot of Brown's novels would fit that description. That was the genre that he worked within probably the most. So as I said last time, the Gothic romance was a popular type of novel written throughout the 18th century. Like many of these early novel genres, it originally rose to prominence in England, and then it sort of got imported to America. And as we've already said, Brown is adapting that old form to the new world and new subject matter. So that's an interesting process that we can observe. We also talked about terror and horror last time. There's sort of this terror motif that runs through the entire book. And if you read Edgar Huntley, very similar to what we saw in Edgar Huntley. And a lot of the terror, a lot of the fear in this book comes directly from the unexplained or the supernatural. There are all these mysteries that seem to revolve around at least the possibility of supernatural forces and things that are simply beyond human explanation. And we see that very early in the book, right? We see that in the first few chapters when we learn that the elder Wieland, the father of Clara and her brother, spontaneously combusted one night while praying in his little private temple. So right off the bat, we get these unexplained events, these phenomena that seem kind of beyond the pale, beyond the explanatory powers of science or philosophy. So that's where a lot of the terror comes from the mysterious, from the unexplained, from the potentially supernatural. But what you'll notice about Brown, we saw this, if you read Huntley, you saw it there, and we definitely see it here at the end of Wieland. Brown often will provide some kind of an explanation or some kind of a moral lesson. Some critics even call it a sermon that can often be found at the end of his narratives. So Brown likes mystery. Brown likes to play around with the possibility of supernatural events. But then typically, and I hope I'm not ruining this for you guys, I hope you've already reached the end by now, because there will be spoilers here. At the end of the novel, Brown reveals what really happened, the true nature of all of those supernatural or those apparent supernatural events that we witnessed earlier. So that can be a little bit of a letdown because he does try to explain everything and he tries to embed some kind of moral lesson. And I mentioned that briefly last time, but we will actually see that lesson and we'll take a look at it today and sort of think more about it. And remember, providing moral instruction was an important part of early novels. We saw that with Rowson. We saw that with Foster when we were talking about sentimental novels. especially the ones that centered around seduction plots. We said, moral lessons were really important for those types of books. And what we're going to increasingly notice today is that Wieland, in many ways, kind of functions like a seduction plot. It's not quite the same as what we saw in The Coquette, but it's actually a little bit similar in some surprising ways. So we'll explore that a little bit more. And I mentioned last time that Brown worked within the sentimental genre a little bit as well. So there really is some genre mixing going on here. We're definitely getting a lot of the elements of the classic Gothic romance, but there are other things thrown into the mix. Some sentimental elements, some aspects of the seduction plot, which was kind of a subtype of the sentimental novel, a subgenre. So we'll see all of that. And again, like I said, also Brown is just kind of interested in science. He's interested in unexplained phenomenon. So that's another thread that runs through a lot of his work. So we'll talk more about that terror motif, and also just the final reminder, last time we were thinking about horror conventions, like modern day horror conventions, the kind of stuff that we see in horror movies, the kind of stuff we see in contemporary horror fiction. And I made the argument, you guys don't have to agree with this, but I made the argument that, the Gothic romances of the 18th century, like what we see here, were really kind of the predecessors or the forerunners, the ancestors of contemporary horror, whether it be film or literature. So we were tracking a few scenes back in the Week 7 lecture that kind of reminded us of contemporary horror films. And I think we can keep doing that kind of work here today. So let's pick up in chapter 13. You remember when we left off, Henry Plale was accusing our narrator, at least so far, our protagonist, and I would argue that she kind of remains the protagonist throughout, Clara. Henry is accusing Clara of being Carwin's lover and having entered into some kind of conspiracy with Carwin because Henry overheard, or at least he thought that he overheard, Clara and Carwin talking by the summer house late one night as he was walking by. So of course he's been deceived. We understand that. Clara understands that. And she's kind of trying to explain herself to Henry. But at the end of chapter 12, she fainted. Henry seems to have kind of a change of heart. But then when we pick things back up in chapter 13, she awakes from her fit. But Henry is back to being mad at her. And he goes back to sort of relating what he heard and all of these events that have led up to his angry confrontation with her. So Henry becomes our narrator very briefly here. This is kind of like a narrative within a narrative. It's not super brief, actually. He starts to kind of relate these events in chapter 13, and then this continues over into chapter 14. But he's basically explaining why he thinks Clara is this terrible villain. So he gives some backstory. He explains that, hey, I noticed that you and Carwin were pretty attached to one another. Nothing romantic ever develops between the two of them, but Clara is very interested in Carwin. And we mentioned this last time. Even when she first hears about the strange voices, when Henry first tells her way back in it's like one of the early chapters back in the first half, you'll remember that her reaction was not really fear at first. It was what we described as the sublime. She has feelings of wonder and awe. And Clara's very curious. She's very interested in the possibility of supernatural entities existing in the human world. Like, she's very interested in sort of finding out if there's anything beyond human. Is there anything beyond the sort of human intellect or human capacities? Is there some kind of supernatural force that she might be able to have access to, or that she might be able to one day understand? So this is kind of a feature of Brown's fiction. A lot of his protagonists are like this. They're curious. They want to know more. They kind of, in some ways, they kind of want to exceed the limits, maybe, of human understanding. And I want you to kind of file that thought away for later, because it's going to be significant later when we get to the moral lesson or the sermon that Brown is kind of embedding here. Because part of it has to do with maybe Clara being too curious, or Clara being a little bit too rash in her desire and her attempts to kind of find out the true nature of things. And this is often a problem for Brown's protagonists. They often get into trouble because they almost want to know too much. And they almost go beyond the safe limits of kind of human conduct, if you will. So we'll see that play out as we continue along. But anyway, I lost my train of thought. Oh, yeah. So that's how she first responds when she hears about these voices. And she's like, maybe we're dealing with something supernatural here. And she's almost kind of excited about it. She can't sleep that night after Henry first tells her because she wants to know more. So just keep that in mind. So now as we jump back to the present tense, Henry's kind of criticizing her for being interested in Carwin. But he interprets that as a romantic interest, like, oh, you're into him. And clearly that seems to kind of make him jealous. But I think as readers, we can read it a different way. Claire is just fascinated by him because he's weird and he's mysterious. Now, of course, she does not know that the voices come from him. She hasn't, they haven't put that together yet. But there's something mysterious about Carwin. She wants to know more about him. And again, she's just a curious person by nature. So Henry might kind of misinterpret that. And he talks about the suspicions that he has about Carwin. Remember, Henry knew Carwin before. Henry met Carwin years earlier in Spain. Because like any affluent gentleman of the time period, Henry spent some time traveling in Europe, and when he was visiting Spain, he made the acquaintance of Carwin, who was living in Spain at the time, and had sort of assumed the guise of a Spaniard. So again, Carwin's kind of a chameleon. He can kind of blend into whichever place he's currently in. That's important to remember. These details we get about him in Spain, they might seem kind of superfluous, but they actually kind of matter. Because this is how Carwin is. He's kind of able to adapt to his surroundings. So remember, when he arrives in Pennsylvania, when Clara first sees him, we talked about this back in week 7, Carwin is dressed like a farm worker. He's dressed in the vocabulary of the time period like a clown. That doesn't mean bozo. That means a farm worker, a low-class, uneducated laborer. The kinds of people who work for the Whelans, because the Whelans are wealthy and they're the landowners. So again, this is part of Carwin's mystery. He didn't look like a farm worker back in Spain when Henry knew him, but he does now. So again, he has a mysterious past. He's obviously on the run. He's running from something. Claire is interested in him. But anyway, Henry goes on and on, but there's some interesting stuff in chapter 14 as his little mini narrative continues. Just some things I wanted to point out. For one thing, though, that we do kind of get indirectly during this sequence is more information about Clara's social position. Remember, I talked about this last time. She's a single woman, a young woman, unmarried. She lives alone. Remember, this is a little unusual for the time period. So again, her brother has inherited their father's land. The Whelans have money. Henry has money. So they're of an affluent social class, and this allows Clara to live the way that she does. But she has a degree of freedom that, frankly, was not going to be found amongst women in lower social classes. So this just makes me think of Eliza and the coquette. And the life that Clara leads is kind of the life that Eliza always wanted. this degree of independence, having your own place, not having to be so desperate to marry because you're kind of self-sufficient. Now, Clara seems to rely on some income from her brother because, of course, the eldest son of the family, he controls all the money. Everything's really his, but he might give her an allowance. But again, she has her own house, her own servant, her own setup. So that's what Eliza would have liked. But Eliza comes from a lower class. Eliza's not low class, she's middle class. But her family doesn't have the means to set her up the way Clara is set up. So just kind of an interesting thing to note. So at first we might think Clara's position is very enviable, and it is in some ways. But we also begin to realize how dangerous it is in this time period and also in this isolated physical setting. Remember, they're not far from Philadelphia, but they're not in Philadelphia. They're in a more rural area, maybe in the modern day, it would take you like 5 minutes by car, probably, to get to where they are from the city. Nowadays, this is all probably the suburbs of Philadelphia. But in the 18th century, remember, we're in the colonial past here. Brown is setting this narrative somewhere like in the 1750s, maybe 1760s, pre-revolution. So in the colonial past, this is still kind of a remote area. Even though you can get to Philly pretty quickly, they're still kind of in this rural corner near Philadelphia. So they're somewhat isolated. So there's obvious danger, like physical danger, like what if robbers show up? And Carwin really exposes that by impersonating robbers at one point. And we'll return to that scene that we saw last week. But there's the physical danger of maybe being robbed or murdered. And again, Carwin brings a lot of that to light. But then as we kind of remember from the Coquette, there's also the danger to her virtue. And as we saw in the first half of the narrative, it seems apparent around chapter 9, I think, when Carwin shows back up in her bedroom that he's there to rape her. And he even seems to admit that during their little sort of confrontation before he flees. So there's this real sense that not only is her life potentially in danger, but also her reputation, her virtue as, a single woman. And those are all, of course, very important things for someone in her social class. So yes, she is independent to a certain extent, but she's also kind of at risk. And that plays out in a lot of interesting ways. So that's part of the reason why some critics read this as kind of a seduction novel. And again, we'll return to that idea. But also in chapter 14, just kind of a brief thing, almost like a throwaway line, but Henry mentions that he first learns that Carwin has escaped from prison in Ireland or something by reading a newspaper. So he's in Philadelphia. Henry is attending to some business, and he's taken a little break. He's in like a boarding house or a coffee shop or something. I don't remember. It doesn't matter really. But he's just kind of lazily looking at a newspaper, and he sees the headline about Carwin. So he reads further, but then what I want you to notice is just, two things. First, we talked about newspapers weeks ago, and I mentioned that the realistic novel kind of grew up along with the modern day newspaper over the course of the 18th century, the 1700s. So we kind of see a little glimpse of that here, because Henry is obviously reading a newspaper. But what's interesting, this is also kind of a revealing moment in terms of like early American print culture. Because after looking at that article, Henry goes to the printer's house. So the printer who puts out this local Philadelphia newspaper just so happens to live nearby, and Henry knows him. Now, this might seem improbable, and it kind of is, but remember that in colonial America, print culture was still not a big thing. And Philadelphia, even though it was a city, it's still not really big by modern standards at this point in its colonial history. So this is kind of a small insular world. So Henry knows the printer. he goes to the printer's house and he's like, hey, I just saw this article in your paper. But Henry knows, as we know today, that a lot of smaller regional newspapers will reprint stories from bigger, more national papers, or just papers from maybe bigger cities. And that was especially common in early America. We had news of our own, of course, but we were colonies. So we still had to report on what was going on back in the motherland, right? So we would still reprint stuff from English newspapers alongside the original stuff that was maybe happening in our own backyard. So Henry understands this, and he goes to the printer and he's like, hey, show me the original article that you're taking this from, because I need more info on Carwin. So this doesn't really matter that much for the plot, but it just makes me think of our earlier conversation about newspapers and how realistic novels and newspapers were kind of like cousins. They're not exactly members of the same nuclear family, but they're obviously related and they kind of grew up together. But also just a reminder that in America at this point in time, the people responsible for print culture, the people who were kind of, putting out various types of text, it was a small group. It was a small community. So they all were kind of in the same general social class, or they might have even known each other in some cases. So just kind of an interesting little moment there. But again, not critical for our purposes. But also in chapter 14, we see another common convention of the Gothic romance, which is improbable events. So while he's in the city, Henry runs into his old servant from Germany. What a coincidence. And the servant has some news about Henry's former German lover. I so don't care about that whole subplot. And that's something I want to talk about today in reference to Brown. He does this a lot, right? He has all these different narrative threads, all these subplots, all of these sort of peripheral characters, and he doesn't always tie all of that up at the end. There's all these sort of loose ends, and we'll see that again at the end of this book. So again, the whole subplot with Henry and his European adventures and the woman in Germany that he eventually marries, he thinks she's dead, she turns out not to be dead, whatever, right? I mean, we don't need to really care about that, but we need to understand that Brown did not revise his work. So modern day scholars and critics talk about this. It's a real deficiency. I mean, Brown had a lot of skills as a novelist, and he had a very powerful imagination, I would say. But his craft, the actual novel writing craft, might not have been as strong in him as it was in some other writers that we'll see. He didn't go back over his work. So there are a lot of inconsistencies and kind of sloppiness that we sometimes see in some of his narratives. So I'll mention that again as we move along. But then in chapter 15, we get back to our main plot. So now Clara is back to telling us the story again, and we learn that Carwin has invited her to some kind of private conference, right? Just the two of them, which of course she's reluctant to attend based on his recent actions, but it sounds like he sort of wants to explain himself. So after kind of, she's not sure at first, but she eventually decides to meet with him. And when she goes to her house for the meeting, she notices that there's a light on in her bedroom, and it appears that he's already there, which is, of course, spooky. And this is the kind of stuff that Carwin does all the time. And these are the reasons that Clara, and at this point, the readers, still might think that he's supernatural, that he has abilities that go beyond normal human capacity. But she goes in anyway. And we see this over the course of chapters 15 and 16. She goes up to her bedroom armed with a penknife. Don't overlook that detail. Clara is really kind of a dynamic character. I mean, she's quite brave. She confronts a lot of really frightening situations, and at this point, she is armed and she's ready to fight back if she needs to, because of course she thinks that Carwin is a violent criminal who's plotting both her rape and potentially her murder based on things that happened back in the first half of the book. So she's armed, she's ready for whatever happens. So again, we see this is another scene of terror, right? This is part of that terror motif that runs through the entire book. And again, the terror is derived from not knowing. But isn't that so often the case in modern day horror? Isn't a lot of so much of the fear factor comes from the fact that the characters don't understand what's going on. They don't understand who the killer is. They don't even know that there is a killer, or they don't know that the killer can't be killed, or they don't know that the killer is really their best friend or their husband or whatever. It's always that not knowing. The not knowing drives so much of our terror devices. And we see that here. So at this point in chapter 16, she again hears that voice that she heard before saying, "Hold, hold." So you got to remember this. Go back to the end of part 1. If you go back to my week 7 lecture, we talk about some of the events that happen around chapter 9. So if you remember, when she discovers Carwin in her room, back in, I think it was chapter 9, and Carwin kind of confesses, like, yeah, I came here, to assault you. During that whole thing, she's heard this other voice saying, "Hold, hold." And both she and, it appears, Carwin, back in chapter 9, think that that voice that says "hold, hold" is some kind of divine voice, some kind of messenger sent from on high to warn and protect Clara. And Carwin even says, "Oh, this voice is trying to keep you safe from me." So you have some kind of protector that goes beyond anything human. I can't contend with that. So then Carwin runs. And this is the way Clara is beginning to understand what's happening. She thinks Carwin is plotting her destruction, and then there's some kind of divine force, or maybe a supernatural force, that is operating on her behalf, trying to protect her from Carwin. And that force is what's telling her to hold. In other words, stop. Don't open the closet. Don't go in there, trying to keep her safe from Carwin. That's how she understands it at this point in the narrative. And then right after she hears the voice, she sees some kind of apparition. So in my edition, this is on page 167. But again, your pagination is probably different. But this is in chapter 16. She sees a face kind of emerge in the darkness. And this face is screaming or shrieking. And she can't tell if it's a human face or if it's, again, some kind of supernatural presence. So a lot of scary stuff is happening here. And then that sets us up for chapter 17, when she discovers the dead body of Catherine, her best friend and sister-in-law. Remember, Catherine is the wife of her brother, Whelan. And she discovers that Catherine is dead in her room, though, which is weird. But she discovers the dead body, and of course this is a very traumatic moment for her. So some people joke about all the fainting that Clara does, and she has to always be revived, and she misses a lot of stuff because she's in these kind of fits. But think about all the disturbing stuff that happens to Clara. Even just at this point, not even thinking about what happens later. At this point, she's already been convinced that 2 robbers were in her closet plotting her rape and murder. That happened earlier. Then Carwin shows back up, and he's like, "Yeah, I was one of the robbers, and I came back here to rape you." That happened earlier. Now, she's just seen a scary face. She's heard that voice again, and this time the hold voice, which she kind of thinks is on her side, but it always seems to indicate danger. So it's still scary to hear it. And she sees the dead body of Catherine. So she's been through a lot. So yes, it was a convention back then to have women faint and not always be emotionally strong enough to handle the events of a typical gothic romance. But Clara has been through a lot, so I think we can almost understand. And she does not faint here. She's able to kind of meet this challenge. So she sees the dead body. Well, she does faint later, but not immediately. So she sees Catherine. Catherine's dead. Okay. So she immediately suspects Carwin as the murderer. And it makes sense why she would think that. But then her brother shows up. And this is a really well done scene in chapter 17. Wieland shows up, and initially Clara's like, oh God, he doesn't know what's happened to his wife. So she's worried about how he's going to take it, because obviously it's a terrible thing. But then he starts acting very strangely, right? He addresses heaven, and he's not really talking to her at first. He's addressing some unseen person or some unseen thing. And he's making this address to heaven, and he's kind of acting deranged. And then Clara starts to think, okay, maybe he's already seen Catherine's dead body. He knows what's happened, and it's kind of made him go crazy. He's not taking it well. So that's kind of her next assumption. And then he starts to approach her. He starts to walk closer to her. And we don't know exactly what he's up to or what his intentions are. And before anything else can play out, there in chapter 17, they hear all these other people downstairs. There's all this commotion because, of course, this is a crime scene, right? There's all this commotion, and eventually people come upstairs, like her uncle, the Cambridge guy, who I think we meet him later. Maybe he's not there yet, but other people show up, and she eventually, I think, faints and gets kind of led away. She might not faint right away, but she kind of goes through another spell where she's kind of delirious, she's kind of out of it, and she doesn't learn the true nature of what's happened until a little bit later, maybe a chapter or two later. And eventually her uncle, Cambridge, who's not a very important character, but he does show up to reveal some important information to Clara. So he's been abroad, he comes back to Pennsylvania, he's like her mom's brother. And he shows up to kind of nurse Clara back to health, because Henry isn't really helping. Henry's still mad at her. She doesn't see much of him for a while. So her uncle shows up, kind of nurses her. He's a doctor, I think, kind of nurses her back to health. And he also tells her what's really happened. And of course, what's really happened is that Wieland, her brother, not only killed Catherine, his wife, but he also killed his children, and he killed Louisa Conway, a minor character that we met early on that we'll return to later for strange reasons, and we'll talk a little bit about her. And he was planning to kill Clara. So Wieland has gone off the deep end. Wieland thinks that he has heard the voice of God telling him to murder his entire family, to make this sacrifice kind of as a proof of his faith. So this might make us think a little bit of Abraham, and it might put us in mind of the Bible, but also it should make us think of his father. Right? We know that the elder Wieland was kind of a religious zealot, and was weird and had kind of his own beliefs, his own practices. But we all remember that passage we looked at back in week 7, early, I think it was in chapter 2 maybe, right before the spontaneous combustion. And the father is worried because he thinks he was given a task by God. But we don't know what that task was, but we think that he thinks that he was given a task to perform and he failed to perform it. So he now thinks that he's going to be punished in some kind of terrible way. And then soon afterwards, he spontaneously combusts and dies. So the question I had for you guys last time was, okay, what was the task that he thought he was supposed to carry out but had delayed? And a lot of people think that it was converting the Native Americans because that was something that he wanted to do, and he failed in his attempts to do that. But like I said in week 7, it doesn't really sound like he's talking about that, because he's talking about a task that he was supposed to do, but he procrastinated. He delayed it. And he then says, now it's been left to somebody else. I can no longer do it even if I wanted to. Now somebody else has to do it. And all that's left for me, the elder Wieland, is to just be punished for my failure. So it certainly seems, based on that logic, that what he thought he was supposed to do was kill his family. But he couldn't bring himself to do it, perhaps. Maybe he refused, or maybe he was just waiting for the right time. I don't know. But he never actually does it. But it seems like the task, or at least the insanity that infected him, has been passed down to his son. But of course, the way that Clara understands all of this is that Carwin impersonated the voice that Wieland heard, the young Wieland, that Carwin was responsible for that voice, and it's really Carwin who drove her brother to commit these terrible crimes. So let's stop part 1 here, and we'll pick back up and finish the novel in part 2.